All right, so we're gonna do another Scrimba challenge, and this is just a few questions. So what is a side effect in React, and what are some examples? So a side effect is when we use React to gather data from an external source to use with our React data. So a few examples of them, or of it, I have up here. Some examples are like getting an API call, or another example would be to access a database. So by default, React only does these three things right here. It only works with the DOM browser to render UI to the page. So with JSX, and it manages state. So manages state so that we can update our UI and, render our components and use props and etc, etc. But one thing that it's not in control of are things like local storage that we get from our browser, or APIs that we're accessing from external sites. And that's why they're called side effects, or in other words, they're outside effects, because they come outside from the scope of what React is able to do. So what is not a side effect in React? Something that wouldn't be a side effect is tracking state. So tracking state within our app, like let's say a counter app to track our numbers, that's something that's not a side effect. Or another thing is running, let's say, making a login form and making if-else statements to show different users different messages depending on if they entered the data wrong or correct. That's another thing that's not a side effect. So when does React run your side effect function? When does it not run the side effect function? So React will run your side effect function as soon as you render the app. So if you render it and you use effect and you just put in like code into the use effect code, it will rerun this code every time you reload your page or when you make updates to state. So that means it would be almost like not using anything really. And when does it not run it is when you pass in the second parameter of an array literal. And in this parameter, you can just put in nothing, which just means run this code one time and then not again. Or you can pass in dependencies. So you can pass in something like a state. And this means that the React use effect will only run when that state is updated. Otherwise, it won't run, or it'll only run once. So I would explain the dependencies array is almost like an array that you can use to control how many times your useEffect hook actually runs. So the reason why I say this is because it compares itself to its last value. And if that's different, then it'll rerun the function that's nested inside of it. Meaning that if we only wanted to run something once, we could just pass in a hard-coded value, because then it would compare it to itself. And since there's no difference, because 2 compared to 2 is always going to be the same thing, meaning that if we hard-coded something like 2, we would never run the function again. We would just run it once. So the dependencies array is basically just a guide for the use effect, and it's telling it how many times it wants it to run. So that's it for those 4 questions.